We'll get things started. A lot of new faces here, a few familiar faces. I'm probably one of the new faces. I'm the new director of the AVA Gallery. I'm Trip Anderson. Not very many people have been able to say that for a long time. I think I'm 48 days at the helm now, so still pretty new. But anyway, we're thrilled to have you here. We're thrilled to have an artist of Margaret's stature here again. It's been a while, and we welcome you back. Have an enjoyable afternoon. I'm sure she's going to have lots of interesting things to say for us, and I'll let our manager of exhibitions introduce Margaret. Yes, Margaret will introduce Margaret formally.
We have another Margaret here, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, there's a couple.
So welcome.
Thank you. Hi everybody, I'm Margaret Jacobs, AVA's exhibition manager. Margaret Lampe Kannenstine of Woodstock, Vermont received her BFA from the Washington University School of Fine Arts and completed 2 years of graduate study at the Art Students League in New York. She is a member of the Board of Trustees for the Vermont Studio Center in Johnson, Vermont, and her volunteer work for the arts has also included the Vermont Arts Council, New England Foundation for the Arts, and National Assembly for Arts States Agencies, where she also served as secretary for 5 years. Kannenstine shows widely through New England and the U.S., and her work is in numerous corporate and private collections. Known primarily as a painter, much of Kannenstine's focus has been on the natural world and the New England landscape. This body of work is a series of collages created from her old works on paper, centered on the use of color to describe both place and feeling. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Kannenstine.
I'm delighted to see anyone here because I figured everyone I knew would be marching in Washington and Boston and Montpelier. Trip just told me that there's 150,000 people marching in Boston, and there's more than 200,000 in Washington, D.C., and they're all over the world, so I'm glad to see all of you here with me this afternoon. Thank you for being here. Like most artists, I have been doing this for most of my life, starting off with melting crayons on metal steam radiators in the apartment where we lived in Chicago, so I could see how colors mix together. The years in Chicago were also important in other ways, one of which was going to art classes at the Chicago Art Institute. My friends and I would wander the galleries after class, and once by myself I got separated and went way back in the museum and came upon a small gallery of Winslow Homer's watercolors. And I remember to this day the astonishment I felt about how the movement of water was in these little watercolors. Everything else in the museum was so huge, except of course the thorn rooms. If anybody's been there and seen the thorn rooms, they are miniature rooms of all different centuries and styles, and including the Chicago fire. Now, as a child, of course, I loved them. But I also loved the serious, real art that was there. My family moved to Ohio, where my public school art teacher was unusual for those days in having us keep sketchbooks, draw each other, do one-line drawings of buildings and towns, so on. When I went off to college, to Washington University, as Margaret mentioned, I was informed by other students that most of their training in art in high school was making posters for various dances. Well, we had something that was a little more serious. And after my marriage and after the move to New York and the 2 years at the Art Students League, I did my studio work at home. And decades ago, when my children were very young, I tended to work while they were napping. Sometimes I'd do an hour or so more in the evening while my husband Lou was writing his PhD dissertation. Much of what I did then was small in size, some of it in the vein of the surrealists. Those were my collages back then, And they were what you might expect, images cut from books or magazines and put together to make unlikely, unrealistic images. During my recent move to a new home, I came across a few of them and found they weren't bad after all, just somewhat derivative. And after that time, for many, many years, I have painted on canvas, board, and paper. During the years our family lived in New York City but summered up here in Vermont, I would draw or paint small things in the summer and use them as starts for the canvases I did the rest of the year in New York. Although from time to time I painted figures, especially family, my most frequent images were landscape in origin. At times they were good size, say 48 by 60 inches, and very close to abstraction. Then in the late 1980s, I began doing monotypes. Many of them were multi-plate monotypes, some as large as 38 by 50 inches. These monotypes were all made with acrylics, which is an unusual medium to use for monotypes. And they were printed by hand. I had a very heavy metal roller, kind of like any I want to say steamroller. No, I don't mean steamroller, in your kitchen. Anything like that. A rolling pin, like a rolling pin, only heavy, very heavy. My giant work table was built with drawers large enough to hold the biggest sheets, and those drawers bulge by now. Actually, I have brought one of the monotypes along so you can see what thank you. This is the sort of thing I was doing back then. And as I will say in a minute, I also write a long series of jazz paintings. I've done quite a lot of that. My husband was a jazz fiend, and he started a label called Boxholder Records, and so we went to tons of concerts and gigs. But here is what I'm doing with them now. Not all of them, but many of them have been transformed into what you see here. But even with showing fairly often, I have built up a large residue of unsold pieces. And now you'll learn why I started doing this sort of thing. A few years ago, I learned that when an artist dies, presumably one of the really famous ones, the IRS demands an appraisal of that artist's estate, including works still in the studio. Marge Avery, a friend of mine whose father, Milton Avery, was definitely famous in his day, and her mother, Sally Michael, was also a relatively well-known artist. Marge told me that after Sally died, she had Sotheby's do the appraisal, but the IRS didn't like it, made her do it again. So she hired Christie's and had it done all over again. And after a total of 7 years, that appraisal passed, and the estate was finalized and taxed. Now get this, Marge told me that artist estates are taxed at the retail value of the leftover works, not what the artist might have received from the gallery. After learning this, I called my accountant, who verified that that was correct about the taxes. Remember, however, that nowadays you have to have more than a $5 million estate to be taxed, so I suppose most of us don't have to worry, but still, I'm very upset at this point because of the way that the IRS treats artists badly. This is a second way. Maybe after the talk I can tell you more if you're interested about the first way. But in my anger, I opened my file drawers and started to tear some of my works on paper. But soon, I noticed some interesting shapes. Look at there, interesting shapes. And strange color things happened. And that, of course, piqued my visual curiosity. Soon I began playing around with those pieces, and then I couldn't help starting to put them together. Voila, collages! Making more art. There were some interesting discoveries I made along the way. For example, it really didn't matter what subject matter the older work was. For example, it could have been a winter landscape or one of my jazz series. If the colors fit what I was thinking about, then it could be used no matter the subject or the source. So what did that tell me about the materiality of things? I learned that much like composting for the garden, richer soil can come from recycled and reused bits and pieces. The original whole could end up becoming more than the sum of its old parts when translated into new forms. The meaning might be completely different and new, somewhat as when a never-before-seen squash suddenly appears in your compost pile. There's another whole series of collages I made a year or two ago on the history of American art. None of those are here because the intent is so different. I honored, or at least hope I honored, various artists whose work had been important to me. I think the earliest in history of the artists that I so honored by collage was Jasper Cropsey, one of those 19th century artists who found the sublime in nature. The others ranged from Winslow Homer, remember my epiphany at the Art Institute, Winslow Homer and Hopper, Marston Hartley, Milton Avery, all the way to the Abex painters, and finally two women, Grace Hardigan and Joan Mitchell. Someday I'd like to show them, or perhaps turn them into a small book. But back to what's on these walls. While some of these collages are from my imagination or memory, most of them come from sketches I did. Also, most of the collaging was done onto a fresh sheet of paper. One exception is the one here titled Rocks by the Shore, done from a sketch I made while visiting Rhode Island. Saber, you may remember swimming right by those rocks. Yes. For this collage, I actually began with a monotype from a main series. If you look closely, I used totally different things to make those rocks, because Maine rocks don't look like that. Maine rocks have more pink and peach and orange next to them. Finally, I drew with oil sticks as well as wax crayon. So if you go up close later, you can find parts that still say Maine, and now all the rest with that moving big sky. And you will notice two different collages that are much smaller that feature crabapple trees. Those trees are among my favorite subjects. I love their fleeting beauty of blossom and scent. So each year I draw and paint some variation on their blooming season. These two have notable differences. In row of crabapples blooming, which is right behind my head here, the glorious flowers are delineated by their absence, letting the white paper indicate their presence. In the other piece, behind Margaret, up there on that wall, you can see again, it is multimedia in that I drew much of the background leafiness, but pasted on the blooming branches. In my new house, I have a smaller group of tables to work on in the cold months, but nice for me. My huge table now sits in a small barn garage near the house. It will provide me a place to continue making large pieces, like the three biggest here, that, and this, and that. Down there, these three were begun during a week's stay at the Vermont Studio Center up in Johnson. I hadn't been there in years, although in the past I had been very active working there and being chair of the Board of Trustees decades ago. When my husband Lou died, the staff sent me a lovely condolence card that said they would have a place for me whenever I wanted to come. And it seemed to me that it might be good for my soul to go there that year in January, rather than stay home alone and grieving. Any of you who have gone to the Studio Center or another such place knows how stimulating it is to be somewhere with only other artists and nothing to do but paint, print, or sculpt, and eat well 3 times a day with those artists. And once during the week to open your studio to everyone. All the participants trail around through the buildings and compare notes. Thank goodness, it's all done in a truly heartfelt and non-competitive fashion. My guess is otherwise most people would be too worried to let others in their workspace. I'd like to mention the winter collage over here. It was begun at the Studio Center and finished over the next months at home. One day I stayed in the dining hall after lunch and drew the Gion River right outside the windows. The central building of VSC is a huge old red mill, and obviously this river was used to power it in the old days. It can be very dramatic as water tears by, or as in this time of year, pours itself into shapes of ice. This collage has drawing as part of it as well. Not all of them do, but as you wander around, you'll see some of them have many media. Going from the largest to the smallest, both AVA and the Artistry Gallery in Pomfret hold small work shows at Christmas time. And last year, I decided to make some tiny collages to enter. These were the first really small things, other than sketches, that I had done. I almost always use a rectangular board or paper, and these are squares. It turned out to be really interesting and even fun to see what good size ideas I could put into little spaces. This so captivated my imagination that I kept on making these little ones. In fact, a cardboard package of 6 more boards just arrived this week. I will keep making the little images. But I won't give up all these other sizes. It feels good to vary things up as much as possible. Thank you. Now what I would love to do is have some sort of a conversation. I've been talking. I'll bet you have things to say or questions to ask.
With this piece that's behind you, it looks like you've integrated some kind of fiber at the bottom.
Yes,
Is
that is fine.
Is that like a one-off, or is that something that you see continue doing or integrating something more?
That just happened to come wrapping some flowers, and I felt I had to use it. I thought how fun it was to use something like that, and I would like to do it again. In fact, I received some amazing wrappings that were ecologically sound wrappings that came around Christmas gifts that were so beautiful that I may use some of them. They were somehow made out of paper and cut until they were puffy and honeycomby. I don't know how it was done, but it was gorgeous, and it crossed my mind that I might do something with them like that. They're more 3-dimensional, so I don't know, that poses a different problem. Yes, Peg?
I have a question about the center, the dark trees there.
Yes.
It's so unified. I wouldn't know it was a collage. It looks like a painting from here. Just wondered whether that just happened or...
It did just happen, because as I placed the things, I could see that it was becoming more and more painter-like and less cut paper-like. And I happen to like that, so that's the way it turned out. And I liked, as I was doing it, the big shapes in the middle, and then a few balancing, I hope, small pieces to hold it together at the edges. Yeah. Thank you. Judith.
Do you ever combine torn paper on a large scale and then use a stake just one place so that cut that out as the finished canvas, as the finished picture? When you begin to work on a collage, do you envision completing a collage the size of the paper you begin with, or do you sometimes collage different papers and then choose a space that somehow surprises or speaks to you?
Well, I've done something not quite like what you're asking about, but similar. This very week I was working and I was doing a collage, one of my evening ones, about the size of the tree that Peg mentioned, maybe a little smaller. And I realized that the composition was off, and the more that I studied it, it was too tall. And so I just lopped the top off, cut about that much off, and now the composition works. That's what I needed to do. But it was done because of that. It wasn't done because the top was so beautiful itself that I needed to use it for, I will use it for somebody else. But it was done because I needed to do it compositionally.
Do you map out? Do you have a line and then fill in, or do you just use your space of your pieces and see? Like,
Sometimes I will start with the sketch I'm looking at. I will draw some of it onto the big piece of paper. And sometimes, so I'm giving you a long answer to your good question. I do both. Sometimes it's just moving the pieces around to create the composition, and sometimes it is, well, I want the hill to go exactly this way. So I then have a drawing. I think this one has no drawing underneath. Some of them do and some of them don't. Yes?
I work with children and I have been a total failure at collage.
Oh,
Do you have any ideas about how to present them? What I've done is ripped a magazine with pretty colors
sure.
into usually very careful squares, because that's the way I am. And then say, now put these on paste and do something. And I don't think that's sufficient. I don't know if there's a way to do it, or...
Well, you're giving me some ideas, and I don't know if they're the way or a way or anything, but I wonder about not making them all squares.
Right.
That's number one.
Right.
And then number two, if the kids seem flummoxed and don't know what to do, show them something else. Show them a bunch, get a bunch of fruit in a bowl together and say, make a collage out of what you're looking at.
Right.
Or paste up another picture and say, can you do something like that with these squares and rectangles and circles?
I know, I just realized as you were talking that as a child, I had a wonderful set of gommettes, little circles that, and maybe squares and other shapes, but they were all manufactured, that you licked and then you put, and you were supposed to make shapes with them. And
Yes.
maybe either that inspired me or that circumscribed it. I don't know. I still try to do irregulars and ripped paper and.
Well, if you are happier in squares and rectangles, then don't use big sheets of torn paper, but let the kids go a little free with what they're doing.
Yes.
There's a way to do both, I'll bet.
Thank you.
Or look at Mondrian all the time. Yes, Sabre.
I know exactly where you were when you did that painting.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't used that exact subject myself, but I thought about it. Anybody who knows contemporary art or art history would know there are so many different ways of interpreting any one situation. I'm not going to ask a question so much as ask you to say something about why that is so. Why are we all so different?
That's a huge question. And I doubt if I can pull that together in the next few minutes, because if we were not all different, life would be very boring. You would have all painters and no sculptors, or all trombonists and no drummers, or you wouldn't have, in visual arts, you wouldn't have all the ways of seeing that there are. I can imagine you sitting there sketching entirely, not just imagine, I know I've sketched with you, and we sketch in very different ways. You are very architectural and precise, and I am more free-form in everything I do. So there's just two of looking at the same thing and seeing it differently. And I suspect every artist has a different way of responding to seeing that rushing water and that wall of Johnson Woolen Mill and the ice cubes piled up. Those aren't cubes, those are house size, piled up at the bottom that are all in shadow. And probably every artist I've ever talked to would see that differently, paint or sculpt it differently, or write about it differently. We all have different ways of perceiving the world. Yes, Mary?
This painting again is so free. I mean, do you listen to jazz when you're painting?
Oh, that's very interesting. I do not, but I feel a kinship to jazz. But I tend to work in silence. I really relish silence and hearing in the silence, hearing maybe the rushing water or the bird sounds outside or something like that. But I'm one of the few artists that doesn't have music on. Yeah, and it would alternate between jazz and classical because I love them both.
I have another question.
Yes.
Some collage artists make their lines invisible, and you would never be able to see the edge of a paper.
Right.
And it's a lot less like collage and more like painting. And you, I think, do both in some places, but is there, why is that? It's just the different individual.
It is, I think, yes. And we all approach making a collage differently. I'm sure everyone here knows the very famous and wonderful artist Margaret Bogosian. Now, his collages are made in an entirely different way from mine. He told me one time that every little piece of his collage is hinged with a little tiny hinge of wheat paste, as though it was, the only other people I know that do anything like that is people who collect stamps. And the stamp album will be filled like that. But now Farragon attaches his collages that way, and often in his you don't see the edge. Sometimes you do. I have one of his at home where he has, it's called silhouette. He's cut a shape out of a piece of paper, and then another smaller one in that, and then smaller and smaller. So you see this receding figure of a woman that in the end is a letter. But it's, and each one of those pieces was put down separately. So there you see the edge on purpose. But the rest of the time you often don't. But it's interesting because it is a choice of making it visible or not visible. Well, if anybody has more questions, I'm happy to answer or just get involved in a conversation. But there's all kind of nice goodies there if people want to grab some food and come back and sit down or just wander around more. I have no idea if I've used the proper amount of time, Margaret, or not. And
Well, I think it's a little less,
a
but
little less.
yeah, but
Well,
that's okay. But thank you. Thanks for everybody for being here, and yeah, feel free to look around and
And as I say, I'm happy to keep on talking if you have more you want to query me about or talk among yourselves and get in arguments about art.
I think it's very cheeky that in this piece about this rushing water and tumult, that you have escaped from the
Yes.
frame of the rectangle, and I can't
Yes.
look at that without laughing.
Uh,
And the way that it really cranks up the energy
oh, good,
and makes that
good,
more
thank you.
noisy and,
Yeah.
as you say, to
Yeah.
me.
There's another one behind you that is spring rush on a little brook, which I let come out too. Yeah, same idea. That pouring energy in the spring. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Peggy.
You're welcome. You're welcome, everybody.
I was gonna say something.